Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. We are going to visit the city of Porto, or Oporto in Portuguese today. The city of Porto sits at the mouth of the Duoro River in northern Portugal. We'll visit it today, but first, this is Latina Literati. The city of Porto is, of course, the center of the production of port wine. And so millions and millions of cases of this wine is produced in the Duoro Valley. Porto is the second largest city in Portugal. It is densely populated and very beautiful. There are many churches and buildings that have the beautiful ceramics and tiles on their walls. But let's get back to the wine. Over 100 grape varieties are used in the production of Porto wine. And since the 1700s, there has been a denominación de origen. That means that only the area of the Duoro Valley can produce official port wine. And the British love port wine, and they have been importing it for hundreds of years. So when you're in Porto, you can see the UK fabricators and the different brands of Porto wine right across the river. Huge bodegas, warehouses, where the wine sits, waiting to be taken around the world, exported to not just the UK, but really all over the world. In the fabrication of Porto wine, throughout the Duoro Valley, along the river, the hillsides are just covered with vineyards. The fermentation is stopped early, so you have a higher alcohol content, higher sugar content, and that's what makes Porto so sweet. It's considered a dessert wine and is offered in many, many restaurants around the world as part of your dessert selection. The city of Porto is very steep, so there's a very steep grade taking the city down to the river. And so there are trams and cable cars that take you up to the higher parts of the city. I walked a lot of hills in Porto, but it's a very beautiful city, very charming city, small streets, very old city. The part that is along the waterfront is called Miragaia, and the Miragaia district says to have gotten its name from a legend of a long time ago. There was a queen, and she was taken to the Muslim palace on the other side of the river. You'll recall that for hundreds of years, Portugal was divided. Part of it was part of the Islamic Caliphate, and the other part was part of the Christian kingdoms that were trying to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula. And so Gaia, the queen of the Christian king, was taken to the Muslim palace, Islamic palace, and she fell in love with the king there. So when her husband came to rescue her, she kind of didn't want to go. But after he destroyed the palace where she had lived, they were on the boat across the river, and she was weeping uncontrollably. And he asked her, "Why do you weep this way?" And she says, "I look at the palace where I was once so happy." In other words, she'd been so happy, so in love in the palace of the Muslim ruler. And her husband, in a fit of rage, cut her head off as he screamed, "Mira, Gaia! Look, Gaia, then look," as I take my vengeance, obviously. So the entire front part of along the riverfront in Porto is called Miragaia, after the queen that was killed for love. Porto has been a center of trade for many, many hundreds of years. And not only is it a center of trade for wine and other agricultural products, and of course mariscos or seafood, but cork products, amazing artisanal handicrafts from cork. You have wallets and you have bags and you have housewares, just beautiful things made from cork. And of course, it's a very sustainable product to use because of course the cork grows back. I'm not sure if I've ever talked about how cork is produced, but cork is basically the bark of the cork tree. tree that then grows back. So it's a sustainable product to use. And Portugal has done a beautiful job of really elaborating wonderful handicrafts with the cork materials left over after they, of course, make corks for all the wines they produce. In Porto, I found in the north of Portugal that there are a lot of people that speak Spanish. You're only about an hour away from Spain. So I really found that people speak more Spanish in the north than in the south. I mentioned before that there was a long-standing trade with England, so the children, at least in Lisbon, learn English as part of their studies, and so many people speak English as opposed to Spanish, which is quite strange because the languages are really similar. There's also another fable or a story that I want to share with you in Porto. It is a story of Pedro Sem. CEM means 100 in Portuguese, so it's meant to mean someone who has a lot. And Pedro Sem was known to be a wealthy merchant. He marries his daughter to a local noble, and he is said to have proclaimed, "I am wealthier than God Almighty." And that very night, all of his ships sank as they were coming towards Porto. And then he is said to have gone from Pedro Sem, having everything, to Pedro Sen, S-E-N, meaning nothing. He had nothing. It's a story that is told in Porto, and I thought I would share it with you. These stories that I share with you give you a sense of the history and the lore of Porto and northern Portugal, but there's so much more here. There are just amazing places to visit, really good food. The seafood, of course, is without end. There's so much seafood offered on all the different menus. And of course, the center of Portuguese cuisine, as I've mentioned before, is cod. So there is bacalhau com natas, which is cod and cream. There is Gomez style cod, which is cod cooked in milk with potatoes. There are other things like grilled sardines. So there is an innumerable number of dishes that are offered in Portugal, especially in northern Portugal, that are based on seafood. Very delicious. When you go north, my recommendation is to take the train or the bus, but the train just allows you to see the beautiful coastline, the towns as you pass them. Coimbra is a beautiful university town. It's one of the oldest universities in Europe. And so you really get a sense of the landscape. The Portuguese themselves say Portugal is the California of Europe. So there is a lot of similarity in the coastline and some of the mountains and of course the wine regions. And now to my favorite part of the video, the book recommendations. And today I'm sharing with you 3 books that are representative of Portuguese stories because I really want to give you a sense of what the Portuguese perspective is, not just through their stories, but also the writers that are represented in the recommendations today. So the first book I'm going to recommend today is called The Return by Dulce Maria Cardoso. And she herself was raised in Angola, as many millions of Portuguese who went to live in different parts of South America and the Atlantic islands like Cape Verde, the Azores, Madeira, and different parts of the Portuguese Empire in Africa and Asia. When in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, these countries then are given their independence by Portugal, many of the Portuguese, even though they may not have visited Portugal, decide to return. And so you have millions of people returning, and they were called the retornados. And this is a story of these people returning to Portugal, their stories specifically from Angola. Really recommend it. I mean, it just gives you a completely different perspective of what it means to be an empire. These are topics that are not normally discussed. When an empire stops being, what happens to the people that are left behind, basically. So again, Retornados, The Return, a fascinating book, really recommended. And as always, check your library, check your local booksellers. If perchance that's not available to you, we always include independent booksellers online in the description box so that you can acquire the books if you'd like to. The second book I'm going to recommend to you today is called Tales from the Mountains. And this book, although it wasn't published recently, the stories are going to be the same. These are stories from the mountains of Portugal, from the villages of Portugal. This is areas where perhaps you'll never go as a tourist, but what's it like in the mountains when you first get electricity and you first get water and you first get access to modern living conveniences, and what happens to the different towns. So it's a really good read, highly recommend it. The third book that I'm going to recommend is called The Cork Boat by John Pollock. And just like the title, Cork Boat, there is a speechwriter decides to build a boat, and he asks all of these bartenders to save their corks, and he collects 160,000 corks and builds a boat to go down the Duoro River. So it's his adventure, and it's a fun read. And it gives you a sense of how important corks are and how long it takes to gather that many. So enjoy these recommendations. If you enjoy the content today, we would love to hear from you. What is it that you're reading? We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about in these videos. We would love to know what you're reading, what you'd like to hear. We've done it before, we'll do it again. Tell us what you'd like us to research and present to you, and we will. We'd love you to subscribe to Latina Literati. Thank you so much, and as always, con mucho cariño, mucho salud, mucho amor. Gracias.